Hello class, so I'm back. Yes, I'm a few feet away from where I was last night, and I'm here for symbolic reasons. Obviously, Socrates was on trial, and he was ordered to drink hemlock, and Plato and Socrates are likewise famous for examining the question of what is justice, trying to come to an answer. What is justice? And so we could just sort of think about what is justice right now, right? So in other words, when we're thinking of justice, we're considering how it is that laws are implemented, and then likewise how rights and equality is understood. But one thing that is critical there, of critical importance, is also the absence of those things. So in other words, the absence of justice is also a way in which we understand morality as well, or the absence of virtue, right? So when those things are absent, we call justice into question. So there's some interesting elements there, but I want to also think of some specific points that are made in the Apology, okay? So in the Apology, we have a claim that we touched on in an earlier video, where Socrates is stating that he actually doesn't have knowledge, and that he wants to go see who does have the knowledge, so he turns to the experts who claim to have a lot of knowledge. And so he figures out that the people that claim they have a lot of knowledge actually don't have as much knowledge as they claim to, whereas they are not as wise as him, because his wisdom is an acknowledgement that he has an essential ignorance, okay? So that essential ignorance is a way that we understand knowledge. So knowledge there is an acquisition of truth, and then likewise a way that we're thinking of epistemology as well, right? So there's also an inquiry into what exists and what doesn't exist. So for example, does justice exist or does it not? So some students were thinking that this is a binary, that in other words, it's, metaphysics is just two ways of looking at things. That there is the two ways there, that in other words, there's a presence and there's an absence, but there's also other ways of thinking about it, right? So in other words, what is justice? What is justice is not just understanding what it's not, it's also looking into what it is, right? And so we just answered that a little bit in terms of understanding how rights are distributed, understanding how law is implemented, paying fines, etc. So, but then there's also its absence. So yes, there is somewhat of a binary, but that's not the only way of thinking about it. So we have that. So we have the absence of knowledge that's claimed by Socrates, okay? And that is metaphysical as well as epistemological, because we can think of epistemology as the study of knowledge, and when we're getting to higher knowledge, we're getting away from common opinion. So that's what Socrates was working to do, is get away from common opinion so that he could get to higher knowledge. And common opinion doesn't always have elements of truth in it, okay? So it's unexamined knowledge. It's unexamined belief. So likewise, belief also has elements of that are not wholly truthful or wholly understood, and likewise faith does too. So the calling into question of faith, for example, is part of the reason, I think, why Socrates was looked at as an atheist or being impious, because his primary goal was rational knowledge. And so when you're using rational knowledge, there is a tendency to move away from faith-based assumptions or opinion-based assumptions to get us to something that looks more accurate, to get us to something that looks more like scientific thinking that we think of today. So philosophy in its beginning, in its inception, is a lot of how it is that we get to scientific thinking as well. So Plato and Socrates have elements of scientific thinking in their way of thinking about rational inquiry and working toward that. So it's not just about questioning, it's getting us to the answers that are based in rational thought and truth, and that is virtuous as well. So when we're thinking of virtue, we're also thinking of its absence. In other words, things are not virtuous. And when things are not virtuous, we call those into question and think that they're immoral. Okay? So then also touching on metaphysics and the question of rational inquiry, we could see that rational inquiry and metaphysics are actually tied together. So they're inextricably linked. And then likewise, ethics is also has elements of metaphysics. So I guess what we should see there is that metaphysics is a grounding for how it is that we're looking and understanding things, calling into question, and then likewise coming up with answers for those things. So an inquiry, if metaphysics is an inquiry into what is, it likewise is an inquiry into what is not, and then also getting to answers for those things, okay? So I think I've made that point clear. And then also as far as how it is that Socrates is working with death, this way of working with death also is interesting because he states that it doesn't make sense. It's not courageous to be afraid of death, because death isn't something that we should fear because we don't know it, right? So there's an absence of knowledge about what happens after we die, right? And so that mortal question is of primary importance for the way that we are considering death. So death has a lot of this presence, absence, something versus nothing, those kind of considerations. So remember that when we're thinking of nothingness, it's not just nothingness in general, it's a basic negation. There's a logical way in which we're understanding the way things are not, right? In conjunction with how something is. So like we pointed out earlier, this negative wisdom that Socrates has is very important for knowledge, because knowledge is understood with respect to what is not understood as well, okay? So there's that relationship. And the relationship to death, okay? So we have parts and wholes relationships. We also have the question of nothingness. And likewise, we might also start thinking of ideas of freedom as well. So in other words, the question of freedom also has to do with wondering whether or not we can do anything we want, right? And so this question of doing anything we want always is measured against what is true, right? And what is the case and what is determined. Those kinds of questions are deterministic, and that's what philosophical thinking is getting us to not only call into question, but also to come up with answers for. Okay, so I think that's about it, and we'll go ahead and take it from there, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.